Apologize. I have a new computer and unfortunately my camera is not working today. So I logged in. So I'm really sorry about that. But we'll go ahead. Nate and Sohaila are also members of the Catalyst team, and we've been working with different project teams to get them started. And I hope it's going well for all the teams and the interns. And now we have an exciting day today. We have Linda McAllister, and Linda has been a long-time Catalyst advisor, MD, PhD from Stanford, and then VP level positions with Cepheid, Freenome, BD Biosciences. And before that, she was at Roche Diagnostics, and she was also involved with the key role with the pharma jet needle-free injector for vaccines and therapeutics. And David Kim, again, a very long time Catalyst advisor, MD Johns Hopkins, MBA Stanford, and Assistant Chief Internal Medicine at Kaiser South San Francisco, more than a decade in venture capital with MPM, Pinnacle Ventures, and now he has his own venture fund in the digital health space. So I'm sure we'll have a great discussion on TPP's diagnostics, medical device, digital health. So I'll let you all take it away. Do you want to start, Linda, and the diagnostics, and David follow up with digital and medical
Sure, that would be
devices? Does
great.
that sound?
Sure.
Um, I guess what I propose is maybe just hopscotching at a high level through the TPP from a diagnostics perspective. And then maybe I don't want to talk for more than 5 or 10 minutes. Let me see if I can share my desktop here. Okay, something should be coming up, and then we can open it up for questions. Turn it over to Dave, and then we'll open it up for questions. Do you see the TPP with some yellow highlights?
Yes, yes.
Very good. So I guess a couple of just framing comments about this document. It's super important and all these fields matter, but most of the fields are dependent on each other. There's hardly any independent variables here. So if you get a hierarchy of if you get your North Star, then the rest tends to flow. And then most things don't go as we all plan in our ideas, in our development. So if you're thrown off your plan, you do have to revisit this and ask what are the repercussions or consequences. And I could tell you stories of missing product requirements and how we dealt with it. And it was a scramble. The other thing I want to say before we maybe look at some of the specific fields, there's a different view that you'll find at the CDC, and I can send this to I think Rupa has it. But this is how a product, is a thing, and we like physical things, but it's what really matters. Most doctors don't care if it's big or small or has mass spec or sequencing. They care what it does. They care how it helps them help patients. So it's the data that is really the lifeblood of your product. So you've got to be really laser focused on building a thing that can deliver the claims that will make the difference to those key stakeholders. So just enough, I think, at a high level to maybe go back to this. Hopefully, I'm not making anybody seasick. Sorry about that. Go back to the top. The intended use, and you can find nice examples, published examples at FDA website. This is a long sentence that really does contain what it is and what it does for whom, where, and how. Some details may be lacking in terms of turnaround time and things like that, but really does get at, I want to diagnose flu when a kid walks into the clinic. It doesn't necessarily tell you, again, the details of technology, but it tells you what you're trying to accomplish. And then it behooves you as the entrepreneur to figure out how to deliver to that commitment. So the two elements of this that have to come together is an unmet need that you've done market research on, talked to doctors, patients, payers, laboratorians, all the different stakeholders to find a problem we're solving. And then you think you have an idea of how to solve that problem. So this intended use statement really is the most important thing. It's your elevator pitch for your company, for your product. And then everything else really cascades. We tend to lead with technology, and that's great if you're really bullish on your proteomics or your sequencing idea or whatever, but you better have a problem we're solving that is meritorious of, investment, time, money, et cetera. I want to sort of maybe pause on performance requirements here, because I think it's also a good place to say you can't maximize all of these. There's always trade-offs. So back to that unmet need and that claim you're trying to make with your product. Do you want to rule in a disease or rule out? Do you want to triage a patient in a point of care clinic setting so they can go in for a more specific, expensive test? What are you really trying to do? And that will drive these performance requirements. The other piece that this relates to, obviously, hugely, which comes, I think, in the business section, is that competitive landscape. So competitive landscape, what is already out there, standard of care, unmet need, they're all highly related topics, different versions of more or less the same thing. What problem hasn't been solved yet? And I have a unique idea. Sometimes it can be as simple as a test can now be performed in 5 minutes. It would take 5 days. Where it can be delivered, how it can be delivered, the sample requirement. So sometimes it can be kind of an incremental improvement that can make a big difference in patient workflows and the delivery of clinical care. I think, again, design follows from what is your solution? Does it really solve the problem? And if you have to stand on your head and have a PhD to run it, you better make sure that you can really afford to do that. You really got to be solving a big problem if that's what it takes. And earlier in my day today, we were looking at mass spec again and how generalizable mass spec will become in clinical diagnostics, because it is a difficult technology to implement. So this is kind of a part and parcel of your solution. And as we know, I'm sure Dave's seen this, I've lived this a number of times. People kind of will mock up something and build a mold and start injection molding things, and they forgot to figure out a way for somebody to actually hold it in their hand. There's no place to put your thumb, and the pipette tip doesn't fit. So these things you really need to take your time to make sure you get this right as you start building out that product. The regulatory path is now it's much more optional than it used to be. It's becoming very flexible. So I'll be dating myself. LDT used to be for tests that were hard to put in a box and make a kit and get out there. It also used to be an interim or transition phase to getting wider access for diagnostic products. But it's now become more of an established business model. It does have its challenges in terms of access, and then now the onus is on you around sample stability and sample shipping and moving the sample to the test rather than the test to the patient and the test to proximity to the sample. So none of these things come without a trade-off. So again, you want to think through it super carefully about your solution and what you're building, and do not underestimate getting samples from patients and samples to the right place to get your result. And so I think sometimes people are a little casual, and I could tell you stories. So maybe just suffice it to say, we used to distinguish CE from IVD. I don't think that's a real distinction anymore with the implementation of the
Linda,
last
maybe
few
you want to
years.
define these words,
Oh, sure.
developed test.
Lab developed
Yeah.
test, where there was a guidance, thank you, Rupa, there was a guidance that was, I don't know, it's been out for over 10 years now, but was just suspended. It was supposed to be implemented in the last few years. So the LDT will continue to go in a fairly unregulated, you're under cap CLIA, you do have to be careful about claims, and people will, but you're basically only regulated from the perspective of running a standard protocol with some reproducibility around that protocol. And you can only run it in a single place by definition. CE mark was the old designation for Europe, and we should probably update this, Rupa. And then, of course, the US FDA strategy around in vitro diagnostics. These are now much more harmonized. In Europe, it's called the IVDR, and it's much closer to the US requirements. Europe used to be an easy market to get into, so companies would CE mark as soon as they got their product ready to go, and then take another year or two to get into the US market. I don't think that will persist much longer. So thanks, Rupa, for that prompt. And again, I think we already mentioned the competitive landscape overlaps right back to your unmet need and what problem you're solving. Me Too's can get through the FDA. I guess that's maybe the other overarching thing. I'm sure Dave will mention this. Should not think about the regulatory process as your goal. You should think about satisfying a need in the market, and then the regulatory is just one of the steps. You can get into the US market. The bar is not that high, but it doesn't mean you'll sell product in this market. Whereas, again, if you look at NICE in the UK, they incorporate cost effectiveness and competitiveness in your approval to get into that market. So I think just keep your focus on the prize of getting into a market with a meaningful product. I'm not going to touch maybe on anything else, I think, at this point, Arupa, because we're 10 minutes into the hour and I'm going to turn it over to Dave. Unless anybody feel like I left anything out, Rupa, that's important to comment on.
No, means I think one of the things I'm thinking, if you just want to very quickly go over sensitivity, specificity, rule in, rule out, like positive predictive value, negative predictive values.
Yes, so I think these are the most important numbers. I wouldn't get distracted. So as Sarupa sort of alluding to, PPV and NPV are going to depend a lot on the patient population you're testing and the prevalence of the condition. So you need to be super careful about specifying the intended use population. So Rupa, it's really important. Thank you for reminding me to say intended use. The population is super important who you're testing. The new tests we have for colon cancer are detecting colon cancer that's at a prevalence of 1 in 400 in that target population. If you look at the study designs, 1 in 4, 300 to 500 is the range in the Exact Science studies and the other studies. So that's a tall bar to be able to. So specificity now, how many false positives are you chasing down when you're testing that many people and the condition is that rare? So that's when these trade-offs about specificity really come into play. And of course, we don't like suggesting somebody has cancer if they don't. So these numbers really do matter to both the patients and the physicians. And you need to do a lot of education and management around these parameters. And they are somewhat fungible. You can dial this up and down. It's a trade-off between your sensitivity and specificity, often early on in your assay development. So once you get pretty far down, you can't change that because you've already accumulated data and locked in at your cutoff points for your parameters. So these trade-offs are super important. People tend to throw around 90-90. There aren't that many tests that really have 90% sensitivity and specificity. It's extremely rare in our space, but you will find tests that have very high sensitivities, but then your specificity starts to drift off in the 60s or 70s, but we're willing to deal with that. And follow up those false positives because the true positives are important enough and it's a cheap test. It's non-invasive is our first test. So these trade-offs need to be managed. You need to understand them and you need to this is one of the most important things in your product spec you need to set very early and then see if your biomarkers and your ability to measure your measurements, not just the biomarkers themselves, but your ability to measure those biomarkers accurately and detect small changes is sufficient to reach these requirements. So those three really, well, PPV and NPV up there with sensitivity and specificity and the relationship to the population you're testing. If you overqualify a population and say, I'm only testing smokers with 20-year pack year history and 60 years old for my lung cancer biomarker, is that useful, right? Because so now you're shooting fish in a barrel because the chance of lung cancer is fairly high. So, you have to really be very careful about setting yourself up for success, but not also setting yourself up for such a rarefied claim that it's not useful to very many people.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you. That was very good, very illuminating. And David, do you want to go ahead with the
You know what?
medical device?
Before we go, you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perhaps those listeners who are interested in the diagnostic area, perhaps questions will be good at this point because there are commonalities between the three different sectors that we're going to talk about, but there's obviously differences and with different emphasis. So if there are specific questions for diagnostics, perhaps we should talk about them because
Sure, let's do it. Good idea,
yeah,
Dave.
because I'm going to bring up some points that Linda brought up, in particular in the digital health area, because this whole area of AI has become extremely important. And in that area, the idea of accuracy, therefore going back to sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, all that good stuff comes to bear as you want to see how good your AI algorithm is. So, but if there are specific questions about diagnostics, perhaps this is a good time.
I have a question in terms of it's kind of just the how when you have an algorithm that could be that sort of borders on screening versus diagnostic, like how do you um justify it to be diagnostic? Is that something that is like pure, like very just very clinical? Is that like an FDA thing? Um, just because it seems like there is more opportunity in the market for diagnostics than a screening algorithm. So I'm just kind of trying to.
Screening is a tall hurdle from the claims perspective in USPSTF, right? And people, what's neat about screening, if you get through USPSTF, at least for now, knock on wood, it goes right into guidelines and coverage, right? So there are but it's years. The review of the CRC, the colorectal cancer guidelines is like on a schedule. It's going to come up 2 years from yesterday or something, right? So you have to really be patient, which is hard for a startup, right? So it's difficult, but there's a big, you get locked in. They're very hard to slow to change. There's a lot of inertia, and it's this realm of public health, which frankly in this country we have to merge these things a little bit more. I think what you're suggesting, Anya, I think is accurate. We are kind of now almost tripping over ourselves doing pre-diagnostics for screening tests. I mean, so Cologuard is out there as a pre-diagnostic to go to a colonoscopy, right? So we've got we're breaking down these workflows, but I think when it improves, the FDA is open to negotiation on this stuff because they do. I was thinking about this. They really do want to improve access to healthcare, and they really do want to be innovative. And they know that people don't like to show up for colonoscopies or, their lung CTs, right? So there's similar moves in lung cancer to get blood-based screening tests that would then get you into your spiral CT, right? So I think I think everything's negotiable. And I do think that things are kind of flipping where you're kind of almost getting things through faster now that are before an old screening test. But they're all special cases, and there's, it's still dealing with a few personalities and KOL, key opinion leaders in some of these spaces that are monolithic. So it's just, there's still that kind of human nature part of it as well. It's usually easier when you're just starting out with the biomarkers to be closer to the definitive thing than the vaguer thing. So diagnostics is, a diagnosis of a condition that has a definition is easier than a screening for a condition that has a definition. But, so I mean, we're screening for type 1 diabetes in kids with a epiphenomenon of autoimmune disease that goes after the beta cells of the pancreas, right? But so we're using an epiphenomenon we can measure in the blood. That's kind of a hard story to tell, right? So that's going to take a lot. But, so if you're diagnosing the thing and you've got gold standard, you're much closer to truth or something that you can quantify and measure and prove, versus the screening aspects of it. I mean, we know, look at where we got to with mammography and dense breasts and MRI and so it depends. It's not a very satisfying answer. It's a good question, and it's often very specific to the condition you're interested in, the space you're in.
Okay.
I totally agree with that.
Great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. There's one question in chat, but you go ahead.
Thanks. This was just a quick follow-up to just, you said the sort of phrase of deciding that the screening test is what gets you into the diagnostic test. Who decides that? Is that something that you can like sort of establish yourself as the gold standard screening test? Or is that
gold standard we have to be careful about predicates, comparators and gold standards, right? And those each have an important meaning in this context, right? And you can't decide on your comparators, but you be careful, make sure the FDA is okay with that. You can't decide on your predicate, but you still have to make sure that you can't choose like the worst test in the market and say I'm better than them. You'll get busted for that. So you usually have to choose a couple. The gold standard usually is, again, agreed upon by the subject matter experts in the field, and then you look at recent FDA submissions and they'll reference it. So I'll just give you a bad example. In this field of infectious disease, we used to actually have to do viral culture for detecting viruses with PCR. And it's like, and viral culture is really hard and takes forever, right? So finally, just a few years ago, it's probably more than a few years, NGS is accepted. So sequencing of the sample and showing that there's viral DNA or RNA, genomes in there was acceptable. So and we get the lobby, subject matter experts had to really campaign and lobby for that. And that affects your costs and timelines of this a lot. And what's interesting about that, your gold standard can be related obviously to your sample. So you can end up with this very complicated thing that from the patient, you might be getting a very convenient sample for your test. But for the gold standard, now you have to go and do like a lumbar puncture or LP, you have to do something really heroic, right? So you do have to really be tuned into that reference so that you can make that claim robustly. Good question.
Thanks.
Yeah, there's one question in chat. Shrey Singh said, I'm in a noisy cafe, so hard to ask verbally. What are your thoughts on diagnostics not being prioritized historically for conditions like NASH and Alzheimer's due to low clinical utility, limited therapeutic landscape, and now we don't know our patient demographics when the therapies are coming up? Example, dementia, monoclonal antibody has an access issue due to lack of established diagnostics.
Near and dear to me, and a topic I'm studying quite a bit right now. And I mean, I hate to say it, and Dave will probably nod and know this to be true. We have full pipelines in the pharma world on both, obviously, dementia, Alzheimer's, and MASH, NASH. So that is a very strong incentive to find these patients. So it's a little bit of a catch up, but it's happening right now. I do think, and I appreciate where the question's coming from, and the person asking it. We should be, you can find research papers going back a long time on Alzheimer's biomarkers. Genentech convened actually a working group a couple of years back. People are probably aware they study this monogenic form of Alzheimer's, and I think in Colombia or Peru, I can't remember, Chile. But so Genentech has been a real leader in this space. And they actually convened a bunch of experts probably 3, 4, 5 years ago, and they wrote a position piece on the quality of diagnostics, blood-based or convenient diagnostics for Alzheimer's. And it was very disappointing. But I'm pleased to report in the interim with now 3 antibodies, I guess, through, there are, some blood-based biomarkers that look quite compelling. But we are definitely playing catch up. It's very difficult, again, like the question that Anya was asking, when your gold standard is autopsy, you got to work backwards to now PET imaging. Okay, now we got to CSF biomarkers, about 5, 6 years ago. So we're working our way now to being able to connect the dots that a blood-based biomarker relates to CSF, relates to PET imaging, and we still have data in cohorts where there's some autopsy data. But it's taken a full generation to really work through that and to get those cohorts. So we can now actually leverage those cohorts and start to really make this happen. But MASH will happen. The other PET one of mine, which there's a professor who came through this program, Mike Schlepak, chronic kidney disease, diabetic kidney disease, really seriously impacts quality of life. And we probably are diagnosing a fraction of it while it can be, intervened upon. And there's some really good drugs. GLP-1s probably affect diabetic kidney disease. So there's some really interesting opportunities and big markets. And last thing, I have devoted my career to diagnostics, which doesn't pay a very good margin or a very good salary. But I do think that information is under-leveraged and undervalued in medicine. I don't quite understand why, but I think we just have to keep pushing because, we are paying $100 to make $15,000, $20,000, $50,000 therapeutic decisions. It's kind of ridiculous. So hopefully we'll get to a transformation where we value information in medicine more. Sorry,
Thanks
you
a
got one
lot,
of my
Liz.
pet peeves.
Thanks a lot, Linda. That was a great point to finish this topic on, to give thought to people. And David.
Sure. I'm going to cover two different areas. They have some overlaps, so but hopefully I could provide some of the differences because how you approach digital health versus medical devices is somewhat different. Let me see if I could share something. It's the same. I think this is the word. Hold on. Yep. Do you guys see this? It's
Yeah.
just it should be just
Yeah,
the
yeah. If you
medical
can expand it a little bit, make it a
expand it.
little bigger.
Could I?
That's okay if you can.
Is
Otherwise,
it
yeah,
is
yeah,
it
that's
bigger?
better. It's a little better, yeah.
Oh, I wonder why it's not. It's pretty big on my screen.
Yeah, it's good now. It's
Oh,
good.
okay. So, so this is. Let me start with medical device, and then there's obviously some adjacency to digital health. Um, I think the important thing for both is one of the things that we need to think about is, and not so much start with product description. Actually, and that's probably true with diagnostics, and Linda brought up you have to first define what the unmet clinical need is. You have to define the problem that you're going after. And that's one of the privileged position that folks that's in the audience have is whether you're in research or in the clinical world, you are seeing the problems firsthand. And you have to leverage that insight into deciding what you're going to work on. And first thing is you want to know what the problem is, what especially those that are unmet, because otherwise, when you start going through the process of developing a product or a service for it, if it's not unmet or there isn't a need for it, guess what? You don't have a business. You don't have a product or service that people are willing to pay for. And it's really, it's a lot of wasted work. So first, you have to define what is that problem. If you show me that there's another product to manage diabetes with a digital app, I would say, you probably haven't done your due diligence because you know, by the time that you have companies that are going public with those type of applications, it means that you should have had that idea 20 years ago. So it's important to define what that clinical need is and work from there. And then even if there's a clinical need, you need to really drill down into how are people going to use it? What is that indication that you're going after? So be able to, answer that next set of questions before going back to the first one is what is your product or what is your service that you're going to define in order to really address the clinical need and approach the indication that you're trying to get to because otherwise I think that the thing that you don't want is, and I could tell you from unfortunately my decades of being in the investment in the venture space is that if there is a technology looking for a home, it's a poor investment. I could tell you that there are sometimes technologies that will win out and they find the right product market fit. But most of the time, in fact, nearly all of the time, that is not a good investment because eventually it may win, but for an investor, it takes years, meaning that you have to carry that idea or the company for years before it actually, finally becomes something that is adopted. So the thing, unless you have that kind of patience, you may want to try to spend time on things that are needed and technology to actually address that versus, the other way around, which is to work on a technology and try to find the right home for it because often that's a hard thing to find. So after you now define what that product is, then you go to, well, how do you get it to a point in the hands of a customer? In the medical device area, it's the idea of how do you get it into the hands of the surgeons or the physicians that are going to be using it to manage patients. It could be all the way from actual surgical intervention to insertion or it could be used in conjunction with their everyday practice. It is, so how do you get it into that? Typically, the process is that you need to not only define what the regulatory strategy is, but understand if there's a clinical validation of that service or that technology. It is really important that you start to define what that is, depending on how it's going to get used. If it's used as something that a physician is going to use in adjacent to how they work regularly, it may not be the regulatory hurdle may not be as high. But if it is a technology that's going to replace how a physician would do it otherwise, then it's a real tall order. So depending on, the level of intelligence that it has and level of invasiveness. So going specifically to the medical device area, if it's something that's implantable, it's going to be a PMA. And it is a long ass process. So you got to remember, you got to, put that into consideration because anything that's going to be implanted will require not, animal work. Potentially may start small animals, then large animals, because you got to have wear data. And then you will have to have clinical information, clinical validation before you get to even the FDA process. So depending on the level of invasiveness, it would dictate whether it's all the way to a PMA to a de novo versus 510K. And this gets into a little bit of issue when we talk about digital health. We don't have PMAs in digital health, but you will often see de novo and 510K if you have service as a predicate. Just moving on in medical device area. This is just now going more into the details of what your product is. The idea is that more complicated it is more scrutiny it's going to go through, and more testing is going to require. So, and not to say that's a bad thing. It's eventually you may create a level of barriers to entry against your competitors, but one of the things that, again, it goes back to, original clinical unmet need is, I think as a focus, you want to develop something that meets or that addresses that clinical need and not over-engineer it, because you don't want to be bringing a big hammer for a very small nail, because, you may have to put a lot of resources and time to basically validate that big hammer, but you may not get rewarded for it. I think that one of the interesting things about the biotech area is their ability to charge tons of money for some of these therapeutics. In the long time ago, decades ago, medical device was able to do that. There are certain areas, electrical physiology was one, cardiac surgery was another area where you could charge like tens of thousands of dollars, up to like $50,000 for implantable electrophysiology device, whether it's defibrillator with resynchronization. You could charge a lot of money for that. Those days are really tough, and that so if you have a technology that can solve that problem and it's not going to cost as much to develop, that's what you want to get to, because ultimately that is the thing that would probably be really desired. One of the things that ultimately that you do need to think about is, what is your exit strategy? Is if you develop something, eventually you want to be rewarded for that, whether it's licensing or you develop it into a company that gets acquired by typically a larger company. Like the large medical device companies, they typically do not do a lot of their own research. Their model is that they're big marketing machines, so that they will buy technologies from small startups. Decades ago, you could get something FDA cleared and these companies would buy them. Now they actually want to see that you were actually able to sell it in the market, which is really a long, painful process requiring a lot of investments. And so that if you have to take that on, you do not want to be taking on something that's really expensive to manufacture. That only way you're going to survive is through some really high expensive reimbursement that is going to be hard to get. So just, you know, what I would emphasize is that if you're going to try to develop something, it's simple and elegant. That's better than something that is over-engineered. But this is where you would describe the details of, the technology that you're developing. And the other thing that I would also emphasize is one thing that Linda said earlier is human factor is extremely important. Extremely important. All the way at the FDA, there are two things that really has been brought up that could delay FDA clearance, and that is human factor. You have to spend a ton of time to make sure that it's usable, and that any dummy could literally, see it and start using it. I know that's not how a lot of medical devices, but you can't make it overly complicated that you need your salesperson in the operating room for 20, procedures before someone knows how to use it by themselves. It really is. You got to make it, easy to use. And the other is data. There's especially those, devices that generate data and communicate data, extremely important to make sure that that is protected, because those are two kind of the hot buttons that FDA is like really focusing on. So make sure that the human factor, and I would even put data in the medical device area, and obviously at UCSF. You're going to be doing a lot of the preclinical work and then hopefully the early clinical work. Just understanding what it's going to take to get through that. But to be honest, I mean, before you even get there, there will be so much to do, even just to get to the point that you get through the preclinical, and actually developing a technology that is can ultimately be commercial. One of the things that I often see, being part of the Catalyst program now, gosh, I don't know how long. It's been a long time, Linda. How long? I don't even know how long we've been doing this. Is that, and this is not the area of expertise for probably most of the people who are on the call, but you gotta know the area that you're going into. You have to understand what the market is, and especially the competition. Just because you have a good idea doesn't mean that you're the first person to do this. Most likely, you're like the 100th person to think about it. It really is important that you understand what is already out there before you start going through this process. The worst thing you want to do is if you talk to an investor or someone who's a domain expert and they're teaching you about this area instead of you teaching them. That is not where you want to be. So really study it. Learn what the competitive landscape is and what they're bringing to the table and how they got to where they are. And often you'll find out why they failed. And it is really important to learn why they failed, because that is going to help you avoid those mistakes as you are developing your own. I could go into more details about some of the other things.
Oh, 1 second. There is a question
Go ahead.
from Brie Matusovsky. Am I saying that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. David, I had a question about, so when you're saying like learning about sort of the landscape of competitors, how one goes about doing that, I think I can imagine doing like a literature review, for example, on things that are successful, since they would likely have sort of more literature available. But things that like are not successful and don't make it to market, I'm guessing don't have as much info, especially publicly available. And so how one would go about knowing about that.
Yeah. This is not the only answer, but one of the answers is you have to find domain experts in the area that you're going into who have some gray hair, who have lived through this, because a lot of these, as you correctly pointed out, are not written, they're not publicized, but the folks who have gone through this. And if you're looking to the medtech area, Chris Jones is a catalyst person. Michael Lesh is, if you want to do something in cardiology, that's who you need to talk to because they have lived through that and they have done this. They've been around for decades and they are going to provide you insights that you may not have otherwise. The other things to do is if there's a particular area, let's say, for example, you want to do, I don't know, something in the cardiac area, you should, you could start with something that's publicly available, meaning the public companies, the Abbotts of the world, the Boston Scientifics of the world, Edwards, if you want to do valves. They will give you some insights about those areas that then you start to go layer deep. And then the other things that you want to look at, technologies that have been developed for certain diseases, and then you can start to go down and you start to look for names, that are associated with some of these key opinion leaders. A lot of the key opinion leaders serve as advisors and consultants to many of these device companies, and so they're associated with many of these technologies. You could, you'll find those out, and often they may be the people that you want to talk to, see, hey, how have you been working in this area? Um, and then there are totally investors who've done this, for a while that you could, but these are more unpublished information that you're getting access to. And if you do enough, scoping around, you will get information. You will find a list of companies who have worked in this space.
And also, Linda mentioned also patents, maybe looking at patents too, Linda
Yeah, that's a
mentioned.
really good point. Yes, if you do a patent search, you can see which players have played in what areas and what their positions are for sure.
And there
Agree.
are really great search engines now. I don't know what you have access to in the university, but searching abstracts, posters, meeting conferences, in your target area, searching even just those agenda topics and those people presenting, and then you click through to those folks and look at what their labs are doing or what they're publishing on. So there are ways to kind of, do free research and kind of find people, as Dave's saying. And most people like to talk about their ideas. So
Yeah.
usually, if you get, I cold call people all the time about things and say, hey, you came up, you're an expert on so and so. Can I talk to you?
Yeah. Well, the one other thing that, if you can attend some of these, focus conventions, medical meetings and stuff like that, you will often what I used to, so I used to, before I went into venture 20 some years ago, I used to be an equity research analyst covering these large medical device companies. And I would literally attend all these conventions, whether it's a spine meeting, whether it's a heart meeting, whether it's CRT, which is an interventional cardiology meeting, the diabetes meeting. Anyway, I would go to these and I would walk the halls, meaning that the exhibition halls, I would take a day or two and just walk through and see who are the companies playing in these areas. So you start to get a sense who are the players. So if you are interested in going into, let's say, spine, you go to a spine meeting, see who's doing what. And you will see both small companies that have small little booths to large companies that have acres. Literally, it used to be that big anyway. But it's a good way to be really delve into the market that you want to get into.
And David, just for the interest of time, maybe move
Yeah,
on to the digital.
sure. So let me switch to digital. Let's see.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
It's pretty quick, and maybe when you kind of sort of switch into the digital health, I was wondering if you could just sort of address the benefits and differences of doing like a software as medical device versus digital health and sort of.
Well, so it's a good question because so I'm a dedicated digital health investor. That's what I've been doing for the last, I don't know how many years now, 8 years, something since 2016. So, um, and I'm currently on my third fund, and in my portfolio we have 20 some digital health companies. And how I do it, and everyone does it a little differently, is really I start very broadly, meaning the application of technology in the healthcare area. Okay, that's what I consider digital health. So software as a service are different software that you deliver mostly on a mobile phone. Doesn't always have to be, but as a distribution channel, it's typically on a mobile phone that you use to manage care. Typically, however, it doesn't. So the things that I would say is there's technology that I invest in to optimize clinical results, but also the delivery of clinical care. So there are now a lot of technologies in the healthcare area that use especially AI to optimize the delivery of that care. One example that's probably one of the hottest area, but now it's like, over invested, is the area of ambient scribe. 5 years ago, people didn't really talk about ambient scribe, but it's one of the areas where you have now unicorns worth billions of dollars because it is the way to optimize, capture of data from the providers that allows them to not only document the clinical intervention or interactions, but also the data is also serves to optimize the reimbursement, the coding, and the payment of those services, which is probably more important than even just the documenting the actual, the clinical results. So there are a lot of technologies now, especially using AI, to optimize the delivery of care because hopefully that reduces the burden as well as the cost of that delivery. And these are the areas that are, to be honest, where the revenues are probably growing faster than those technologies that are used primarily to manage chronic diseases. But fortunately, we are getting certain companies that are now, improving. Like Hinge is MSK, musculoskeletal, and Omada, that's more in the cardiometabolic disease, that are actually getting enough, financial institution attention that they had relatively successful IPOs, which is great because that helps to pull other startups through the process and hopefully, reward them for the years of work. Henry, you have a hand up?
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about another question about like uh what's like the part that like medical device field kind of based on, like for example like biomarkers for diagnostics or like molecular mechanism for like therapeutics. What's like the, I guess like the rationale or like the starting point for like medical device projects
I,
in
I,
those
I
cases?
get, I don't get the specific question.
Oh, yeah, like what's like a counterpart, I guess, in the field of medical device to like, for example, like biomarker in diagnostics, like.
Yeah, no, so um, not so much in medical device, but I would say in digital health. Typically, where Linda's world and my world overlap is that there's been use of technologies, typically non-invasive technologies that are being used to gain insights of what's going on with the individual at a particular time. Typically, it's less invasive, meaning that they're not implanted. Usually, it's something that is non-invasive, such as something wearable, or some patch, or even ambient listening to conversations, taking pictures. Those type of data is now being used to correlate with clinical outcomes. So literally, you name a sense, there's probably technology that has built to optimize, you know, I mean, like for example, one of my companies that we still have a lot of work to do is a company called Cardio Signal that's using the motion sensors, the gyroscope and accelerometer on smartphones. You put it on your chest, lie back, put it on your chest for 60 seconds. It's detecting the twisting motion of the heart, and it has correlated. Now it's being commercialized in Europe for atrial fibrillation. It's doing clinical studies right now to correlate with congestive heart failure. It has studies in the past that has give early signs that you could detect valvular heart disease and also in severe coronary artery disease. So, but that is a non-invasive, readily available device that is capturing non-invasive data. And you could see this, cameras that look inside the eye. You could see, the light camera to check for your heart rate all the way to blood pressure. These are some of the things. Now, how good that technology is depends on your sensitivity and specificity for the clinical measurement that you're looking for, or the biometric information, or the physiologic information that you're correlating to. And that is the things that you need to generate because the FDA, that's what for them, that's what they need. And if you are using a certain algorithm to optimize that, then you need to justify that with clinical data. So does that answer your question? I don't know if I touched that or not.
Yeah,
Dave,
yeah, then, yep.
one thing I think that's coming to light with it, it's a good question because I think there is more degrees of freedom on what you can do with a device in terms of impacting clinical care versus diagnostics. We're kind of stuck in a thing of what we're doing. And so, for example, you just gave examples of diagnostic surrogates that are based on, a hand or, our smartphone. I think there are, apps that alter the compliance of diabetic patients. And those apps have been studied and published in the New England Journal to show that it changes, outcomes in hemoglobin A1C and whatnot. So
Yes.
in
So
ways,
Linda, I mean, you know that I'm an investor in WellDoc.
yeah,
12 years ago, they put the patents out for digital application for management of diabetes. They got
right,
their FDA approval more than a decade ago. So now it took literally, gosh, 8 years for them to find the right commercialization strategy in order to
right,
monetize that product.
wow,
So it really, that's why I go back to the idea, define the problem. Because one of the things that you don't want to do is you don't want to create a technology or a device or a service and be way ahead of your time.
right,
Because I did that with another company, and that company actually folded. So
yep,
it's painful. That's why I understand what is that problem that you're solving first before you start doing all this technology work.
yes.
And uh, to cover any aspects in digital health, and then we'll take a
Oh
question that
yeah, so
Mitchell has.
for digital health, guys, I go back to your competitive landscape, the market, your clinic, the use case, because the barriers to entry for digital health is so low. Anyone could do it. Literally anyone could do it. So that what makes you better than your competitors in having somebody pay you seven figures for that technology? That is where the real key to success is. The companies in our portfolio that are doing really well learned how to create a market for their service or their technology. And it is not so much that technology can't be replaced, it's that they were able to provide the evidence to the customer that this is a technology that has to be used. Typically, it involves health economic outcomes. Literally, clinical benefit is just it's like if you gamble, how you ante up, that just gets you into the game. But if you really want to play, you got to know, what is gonna like what the customer really wants to pay for. And often it is how you're going to either make them more money or save them a lot of money. And you have to really be able to answer those questions. And it depends on the particular area that you're trying to go into. But if you cannot able to answer that, why should somebody pay you $10,000 if they're going to spend $15,000, or they're not going to make any more money and they're going to
Right.
lose $10,000? They wouldn't do it. You have to be able to tell them you could, at the end of the day, have those health economic outcomes. And often early entrepreneurs don't think that way. They just think that their technology is so good that it's going to sell itself. Ain't gonna happen.
And Dave, I think to that the question earlier about MASH, NASH, and Alzheimer's, and there's a lot written. I'm sure you're seeing it in JAMA and New England Journal. We can't begin to cover the volume of these patients. Like the system will break. There's not. So, there actually is a resistance to, we don't necessarily always want to know everything we could know. And then I do like to just a brief anecdote about, Oncotype DX from Genomic Health. People forget that that test recommended that most women not get adjuvant chemotherapy and not suffer the side effects of unwanted chemotherapy. Women did not like to take chemotherapy. They didn't need it. The only people who were unhappy about this was pharma because they were not selling as much drug. But the payers were thrilled. And
Yeah.
it was, early on, when the first test reimbursed at $3,000 plus.
Right, right. So going back to that, the concept of a test leading to a test. This is often the case in digital health because the digital health technology by themselves is not accurate enough for people to say that that is your final diagnosis.
Right.
They do not feel that way. This is a tool. It's help to get you to that definitive test. So in cardiology, one area that people are spending a lot of time on is the diagnosis or screening for congestive heart failure. But no one's going to say, well, this person has congestive heart failure based on a non-invasive digital test. They're going to say, what's your clinical history? I need to do an echocardiogram. I need to do a anti-proBNP, things that people are comfortable with that is part of their standard of care. And these digital health technologies are not going to replace what is standard of care. What you're hoping for, it gets integrated into the standard of care. But it's not going to replace what's there. No one's going to say, oh yeah, this person has cardiomyopathy based on a stethoscope exam. They're going to want to see what's going on with echocardiogram. Okay, and that's not going to be replaced. So you will see a lot of digital health technologies leading to the definitive diagnosis, the definitive test. My hope is that if many of the companies that I've invested in is that step is more efficient. Because one of the things to think about is not so much in the US, but in Europe, there are certain countries and certain markets in which people want to know that you have atrial fibrillation. Because if you diagnose it, guess what? The cardiologist or that health system, bring them in, they make additional revenues evaluating them and then managing them in the future. In the US, the cardiologists are so damn busy. That's not where they feel like, okay, they're going to make a lot of money. They make a lot more money if these companies or these people lead to a valvular, procedure of some sort or placement of some kind of electrophysiology, cans, defibrillators. That's where they make their money because the margins are so good. So if there are, things that help you define that, great. But that's one of the reasons why the valvular heart disease market is just growing nicely. Is because of the margins for the actual implantable medical devices. And so the Edwards of the world, the Abbotts of the world, they want to know who these potential valve recipients are. So they want to screen for those patients who may have aortic stenosis or mitral regurg or whatever. And if more of them they could identify, guess what? More people will get those procedures because in the US is more fee for service. Now, if you get them, more of a value-based, managed care situations, it's a different priority, right? You want to, how do you optimize, let's say, coronary artery disease? It's not so much how many people now going to get cath. It's like how do you get them early enough that you get them to have better, cholesterol reduction or other, medical, interventions that decreases the incidence of coronary artery disease overall in the population. So it's, you got to understand what the market is before you decide, oh yeah, I have the right product for that market.
And David, is there anything you want to talk about all of AI? And then there's one question Mitchell
I don't know. I
asked.
mean, AI is such a ubiquitous word right now. People have one algorithm they say is AI. I don't even know what to say. Ultimately, it has to get, clinically validated. So, or, if it's a more of an administrative improvement in process flow, you have to show that it has a health, or at least, return on investment for the purchase of the technology. So Uh, I would say AI has to, not only have the right amount of accuracy, which is more where Linda is, sensitivity, specificity to, what you're trying to get done, but also the validation. People often forget the validation is probably more important than anything else, especially for those people who are writing a check. They want to know it's validated. So it's 5 o'clock, and I know that
There was one question, I think
okay.
Mitchell said, how do you talk to these people with experience in the field without breaking the non-disclosure agreement? What is the etiquette on that? I will quickly comment for these projects at UCSF where you're under CDA, you do not go and talk to people because it is the PI and their projects. So you do not mention any details of the project. But broadly, David, if they want for other projects, and or Linda, if you could give any advice.
I think there's an art to this, Rupa, and I'm sure Dave would agree. There is a way to be curious and ask questions about a space without giving away your ideas of the solution. And so I think there's a way to engage with people in this way without giving away anything. It does take a little thoughtfulness and mindfulness of it.
Yeah, uh, so NDA is not as stringent as you think it is, but not to say that you go out and talk about it willy-nilly. But what people would do is, yeah, I would disagree overall. You take it at a higher level. You don't go down into we're using this particular chemical or this particular, screw or whatever. You keep it at a higher level and have that kind of conversation. And most people who are in the industry, they've been around the block. They don't yap, and nor should you, you know. So it's really hard to peg anyone specific unless you're exchanging documents. Usually conversations are relatively benign. Is that satisfactory or is there more? Let me stop sharing.
And I guess just related to that question, if you get 15 minutes of some gray-haired expert professor at Harvard in, engineering of XYZ, you really want to hear them talk. You don't need to do a lot of talking. So I think just coming up with some questions about the space, if you've read a few of their papers or you just came from a talk, phrase the question around what they know about a thing or a space or a problem. And you don't have to reveal anything about what you're thinking about, what ideas you have. So I think there's a way to engage where, again, it can be people are usually very flattered if you have that detail interest, they'll think you're brilliant. And so, yeah, it can be win-win.
Yeah, just to let you know, I don't typically sign an NDA for most company conversations that I have. I only sign an NDA when we get to a point where I'm really interested in investing and I want to now go underneath the story and do that level. Otherwise, if I hear so many stories that I can't keep track of who's telling me what.
I agree.
I just want to say thank you so much, David and Linda, for a very illuminating discussion. And all the Catalyst interns, other attendees, I hope it was rewarding. And thank you from the Catalyst team, Nate, Sohela, and myself.
Good to see everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Mhm.
Thank
Good luck in
you.
your
Bye-bye.
studies. Bye. Bye, Dave.
Bye.
Say hi,
Bye-bye.
Jane.
you.
See
Bye.
you.
Bye.